Today.com here with a review of this box. This is volumes 1 through 10 of Giovanni Antonini's Haydn cycle, soon to be, or hopefully soon to be, complete, doing all the symphonies from now through 2032, which will be what, the 200th or 300th, what 300th anniversary, 1732, 300th anniversary of Haydn's birth. That's it, right? Yeah, I can't even add. All right, the bottom line is there are 10 volumes in here. The first 10 volumes, exactly as they appeared on Alpha CDs, but happily missing some of the loopier liner notes and appurtenances that came with them. You know, I've never been happy not to have notes, booklet notes, because these productions were phenomenally well annotated. Well, I mean, they were phenomenally annotated. Whether or not they were well annotated is a whole nother issue. It was actually a little bit weird. And listening to these performances, some of them are very, very good. Some of them are not so good. Most of them I have reviewed on ClassicsToday.com for anybody to look at. If you want to go over there and have a look at the individual reviews of the various discs, please help yourself. I think they're pretty fair for the most part. The performances really range from excellent to absolutely dreadful. Ugh, blah. And so, you know, they're about what you'd expect, aren't they? And it's very, very funny. It's very funny. You know, Haydn wrote a lot of symphonies, and there is a tendency to treat all of them, or most of them, the same, or to treat them in clumps. All the early ones are the same, all the middle ones are the same. And the assumption is that if somebody does one of them well, they're going to do all the rest of them well. Well, it doesn't work that way. As followers of the Haydn Symphony Crusade will learn, these symphonies have great individual personalities, and no two are exactly the same, which makes conducting a whole batch of them as challenging as doing a Beethoven cycle, or a Mahler cycle, or a Sibelius cycle, or any other group of works where each work represents a different stage in the evolution of the genre and the composer's style. The problem here is that Haydn wrote 107 of the suckers. I mean, it's one thing when you're only dealing with 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or even 9, but to deal with 107 individual personalities, each of which really requires its own personalized characterization, well, I don't think anybody's going to do that 100%. Nobody has yet. Antonini does not, on the evidence of these 10. Listening to these performances, they're split between Il Giardino Armonico and the Camera Orchestra Basel, which I tend to prefer. And I think it really brings to mind Tovey's dictum, which I've said many times here, but which I still think is one of the smartest and most astute observations. It was made well before the period instrument people got going. He said, "Scholarship itself is not obliged to insist on the restoration of conditions that ought never to have existed." Yes, that's the point. It's really very, very interesting, and I thought of that listening to these performances because if you considered the relationship between the way things were performed and what the composer actually wrote, you have, in a nutshell, the whole tension which drives the period instrument movement and at which it so singularly fails as often as not. And the reason it fails is really pretty simple. The reason it fails is because we have no idea what things actually sounded like, and because all of the impetus from Haydn's day on was to improve and make more beautiful and more lyrical and songful and full the sound of the instruments, while the impetus for today's musicians is to do something that sounds different at all costs and means doing the opposite, taking away all of the reasons, all of the things that caused these instruments to be improved that composers so singularly wanted, because the literature is full replete with letters and pleas and complaints about the loathsome quality of musical instruments, the ineptitude of the performers, the appallingness of performance situations from Bach's letter to the Leipzig Town Council onward. Everybody was in the same position. And so gradually things improved. And that there were improvements, there's no question. And that the composers wanted them to improve, there's no question. And that today's musicians de-improve them, well, that is a question. Because most of these, what they've done essentially, and what Antonini and all these people are doing, is they try and remove the human error piece. They try and play on better constructed instruments. They try and use players who are, well, they do use players who are more technically adroit, more capable, so that the notes all come out right. But that's not really the point. Think about Haydn's first contract, both of his contracts actually, with the Esterházy family, under which he worked for 30 years and for which all of this music was composed. Now, the Esterházy private orchestra was supposed to be one of the very best in Europe, but it was teeny, 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 tiny, very small. And when it had trumpets and drums with like 3 strings, 3 first violins, and it would have sounded ridiculous. It may have been supplemented by other players who weren't on the roster, or for special occasions you could always hire other people. But still, it was hardly an ideal vehicle for, orchestral composition as we understand it today, and as Haydn understood it too, because it is an absolute rule throughout the entire 18th and 19th centuries that whenever composers could get their hands on more and bigger, they wanted it. Period. And you see that in the difference between what the scores say and what the parts are. For example, if you look at Haydn's late oratorios, The Creation and the Seasons, the orchestral scores are a mere skeleton of the forces that Haydn would have optimally desired. To do that, you look at the parts for the Vienna performances, where you see that these were performances on a Handelian scale. You had triple woodwinds, double timpani, double all the brass, a huge string section, and the choir was in front, not in the back. So, we know that the way things were performed and what composers wanted was not necessarily what they wrote. And there's another way in which it isn't necessarily what they wrote. Haydn was commanded, per his contract, to show up every single morning in the royal antechamber to ask His Serene Highness what he wanted for that day's music. Now, obviously there were some things scheduled once in a while, and they had regular, engagements at which things might have been rehearsed. But essentially, the prince would say, let's do a symphony concert at 3 o'clock. And that's what they would have to do, playing whatever new thing Haydn had written that had never been performed before, as well as whatever favorites the guy might want. And you wouldn't know what favorite he might want until he told you that morning. And this could be true of everything from orchestral concerts to chamber music concerts to complete opera productions, where he would say, I really loved to. 2 weeks ago we did Cimarosa's Bloopity Bloop. Let's do it again tonight. I mean, sure, he had to pay some attention to the logistics and how to get these things together, but basically it was on command, which means that people had no time to rehearse, and that what Haydn put in the score had to be, in some respects, the ideal for which he was striving, not necessarily what he would have heard on the day. When he got his honorary doctorate at Oxford, he sent them a letter begging the performers or the administration to please allow for at least one rehearsal before they performed the symphonies that he had set up for them to perform, because of their many special effects that he had taken quite a bit of care to write into the scores, at which musicians of the day would not have been able to do at sight reading. And that is the story. And in those circumstances, which ought never have existed, as Tovey points out, we are trying to recreate a better version of those circumstances, which ought never to have existed. Yes, you could rehearse them 400 times today, or more frequently. But to go back to these puny, teeny, tiny little orchestras that cause no end to problems of balance and ensemble, still they do, because when you have too few strings, you have too few strings. You can always add more, but taking away is a whole nother issue. You're stuck with what you've got. And when I reviewed these performances originally, I pointed that out. There are many moments in the Il Giardino Armonico performances, especially, where the orchestra, the violins simply aren't audible, and they have the tune. And that's ridiculous. Well, you have a pint-sized orchestra with a few winds and a couple of horns, and you can't hear the tune. It's especially bad in the Farewell Symphony, which is atrocious. And in the slow movements, where you're taking away vibrato, the whole point of vibrato, one of them, types of vibrato, not the ornamental, whatever they period instrument nonsense they're telling us. Vibrato enhances the sound of the violins. That's an acoustic fact. When you use vibrato, the ensemble sounds fuller and louder. And boy, would you want that in a teeny tiny little group that has trouble balancing against trumpets and timpani and woodwinds and everything else. It's so logical and musical. And the foolishness of what these people are doing and the unmusicality of what they're doing is so manifest. And this, despite the fact that I like a lot of these performances. They're vibrant, they're exciting, they're well-paced. There's nothing wrong with in so many ways with the general conception, but the execution is lacking. And it's a work-by-work thing. But anyway, I want to tell you what's in this box. And let's just go through it, and I'll tell you, it is of its type. And it's very good of its type. But that type is not always suited to Haydn's music. And I don't give a damn what the scholarship says about it. The music speaks for itself. And people who I believe have a musical ear and a sense of that wouldn't tolerate some of the things these people do for a second. Not for a second. So, here we are. First, symphonies, the CD1 had symphonies 39, 49, and number 1. It was a very good disc, and it also has, what's marvelous, is the Gluck Don Juan Ballet, which contains the original version of the Dance of the Furies, and a fabulous fandango with castanets, and oh my goodness, it's just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Then we get symphonies 46, 22, which is the Philosopher, and 47, with W.F. Bach's Symphony F Major. Here we find, I think, that in quite a bit of these early symphonies, the tempi tend to be maybe too fast. I mean, you want to have time to actually hear what Haydn's doing. You want to hear the details of the melody. You want to hear the niceties, the balance, and when the music's flying by, like at the finale of The Philosopher. And generally, like I said, Antonini is pacing these things very excitingly and convincingly for the most part. But there are moments where they just sound breathless. And of course, if they played them slower, they would have to have a fuller sound, or else the sound of their teeny tiny little orchestra is going to sound worse. But we do know that there's no way that these performances were played this quickly in Haydn's time. And the players of the day simply wouldn't have been able to do it. It would have been impossible, especially with the instruments that they had, which took time to make notes. So you went at the pace of your instrument, which would have been very interesting if some instruments were quicker than others and they were supposed to be playing things together, and you had to decide which tempo was going to actually win, especially since there were no conductors. Haydn played the violin as often as not. We don't know if there was a keyboard, which is a whole other question, but we're not going to go there. Okay, next, symphonies 42, 64, 4, and the overture to L'Isola Disabitata, and his aria solo e pensoso. I mean, these are lovely programs. They really are. I love the programming. It's quite marvelous. And then we have symphonies 60, 70, and 12 with Cimarosa's Il Maestro di Cappella overture. 60 is the distracted, Il Distratto. It's not a very good performance of that, I have to say. It sounds singularly anemic, because this is a big, fulsome symphony with high horns and trumpets, and it was incidental music, theatrical music. And theatrical music orchestras, as we know from Beethoven's theatrical music, were generally a bit larger than what a composer can afford to get together for concert music. So to do it with the same essential ensembles. Okay. And then we get, symphonies 80, 81, and 19 with Jose Martin Krauss's Symphony in C minor, which is a minor masterpiece. It is a masterpiece, and it's lots of fun. This 80 is just dynamite. It's hilarious. One of the funniest first movements Haydn ever wrote. Then Symphonies 3, 26, and 79, and 30, which is the Alleluia, and 26, of course, is the Lamentation. And so, you know, it's okay. It's not terrible. And let's see, Symphony 67, 65, 9, and Mozart Themos, King in Egypt music. Now, Mozart's music, it's very interesting to compare the Mozart and the Haydn with the approach. The approach works even less well with Mozart, frankly, in some respects, because Mozart's music has lyricism and a long breadth that these instruments in the way of playing, it just fights. You'll see it again in a minute. It's just a battle between the two styles. Then we've got Symphonies 63, La Roxolana, or the Roxolan, whatever they called it, and then 43, which is called Mercury, which is coming next in the Haydn Symphony Crusade. Of course, if you're watching this in the year 3087, it's already happened. And number 28, and then the Bartók Romanian folk dances for some strange reason, probably as a bow to the fact that Haydn often used folk music in his symphonies, usually in the trios of his minuets and in a few other places, which are quite wonderful when it happens. Let's see, Symphony 35 and the Farewell, and 13 with the Scena di Berenice che fai, which is a fabulous concert aria that Haydn wrote much later in his career. This is one of the worst in the series. These are just terrible performances. They really are. And not that they're any different from the good performances. It's just that in some of those you hear the melody, and in this one you don't. It's really bad. You can't get anything like the fire and bite that you need to play the Farewell Symphony properly, especially its outer movements. And it's not a function of speed. It's